She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and if you were listening last week, you know that I have started a little mini-series on the women who have run for President of the United States. We started with a replay of our episode on Shirley Chisholm. By the way, it didn't arrive in time for last week's episode, but my new shirt did arrive, and it is a shirt of Miss Shirley Chisholm. That's right. Unbought, unbossed. I am loving it. I'm just like loving my feminist shirt phase now. I'm just going to keep on buying them and keep on wearing them. If you're not watching on YouTube, click on over to YouTube and you'll see my cute new purple shirt of Shirley. Anyway, we are continuing the series with the first woman that ever ran for the office of President of the United States, which was not Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm ran, she was the first Democrat candidate to run. She wasn't at the top of the Democratic ticket that year, but she did run. And she was the first, though, black woman that ever ran. So Shirley is iconic, but today's broad, Victoria Woodhull, is the very first that ever ran. You know, I'll take a second to just acknowledge it's been a crazy, huge news week. And I was already wanting to do this little mini-series on presidents. And then, of course, we had the big news about Vice President Harris becoming the new top of the ticket for the Democrats for the upcoming election, which is huge news. And we really are going to do a broad opinions episode about that, hopefully with Chloe, hopefully next week. You'll definitely want our hot take, I think, especially given our last Broad Opinions episode where I was ranting and raving about Democratic lack of unity, et cetera, which is more important than ever. But tune in next week for that. Obviously, it is very worth discussing. But today, we are talking about Victoria C. Woodhull, the woman of the hour, Victoria California Claflin Woodhull. I'm saying Woodhull. It's Hull, not Hall, A-L-L. But I keep saying Hall, so I'm sorry. It's Woodhull. This whole episode, I'll probably get it wrong. But you did hear that right if you were listening. Her middle name is California. And her sister's name, one of her sister's names, was Tennessee. So you know right off the bat that Victoria was not born into some sort of ordinary family, right? Victoria was named after no less than Queen Victoria, and she was born September 23rd, 1838. That is right. The first woman to run for president was in the 19th century. And when I was first reading about her, that really stunned me because I for sure thought that the earliest instance of a woman running was in the 20th century, but it was not. It was in the 19th century. In the 1800s this happened. This is Victoria's story. Before we go any further, let's take stock of what in the world was happening in 1838. So in England, in 1838, Queen Victoria is coronated, and Charles Dickens is at this point writing Nicholas Nickleby. The Federal Republic of Central America is splitting up, and before the end of the year, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Costa Rica will become independent countries. This is also the year that the people of the Cherokee Nation are being forcibly removed from their homes and marched across the country in the Trail of Tears. This is also the year that the Iowa Territory is established. That includes modern-day Minnesota and both North and South Dakota. And also in this year, Missouri, the state of Missouri, exiles Mormons from the state. Did not know that that was a thing that happened, but it did, and it happened in this year. And also in this year, the British finally emancipate the majority of apprentices, which was basically finally enacting on the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. But abolition has yet to pass in the United States, right? And history nerds, You'll recall the Civil War doesn't start until 1861, so we're still 20 plus years away from that when Victoria is born. And of course, at this point, nobody has the right to vote except for white men. So Victoria would be running for president before women even had the right to vote. Fascinating. And we're going to dig more into that in a little bit. So this is the world unto which Victoria is born. And in Ohio, she's born in Ohio, J.D. Vance's home state, J.D.'s stomping grounds. And unlike pretty much every single candidate for president in history, Victoria is not born into generational wealth. It's kind of actually the opposite for her. She is born into a family of 10 children. Her mother was illiterate. Her father was more or less a scammer. You'll see a lot of words about him. Buck, I think his name was. People call him a snake oil salesman. He ran a number of various get-rich-quick money schemes in their lifetime. And Victoria barely got any schooling as a girl. She went to school at the age of 8 for just about 3 years. And when she's 15, she gets married, very quickly has a kid, and then school education is over for her. But it turns out that in her family of scammers and dreamers, school was never really a goal for them because they were doing okay in their scamming ways, I guess. In addition to the other schemes, Victoria's daddy, he recognizes the popularity of the spiritualist movement that's gaining a lot of momentum right now in the country. And what do you know? It turns out that both Victoria and her sister, Tennessee, are naturals at it. And they basically start running a whole family business, talking to the dead, healing sick people. Based on a few different sources, it was their daddy that first kind of sets them up for it. He had heard about another pair of touring sisters who made a lot of money. But their show takes off and they end up making a fortune. And especially a little bit later on when the Civil War rolls around and everyone is trying to talk to their dead sons and their dead husbands and all that, they do very well for themselves. There are a couple of sources that say that Victoria really did believe, though, that she had visions and that she could speak to dead siblings and talk to the dead. So it might not have quite been all just a show. It was for her dad, for sure. So I'm going to do due diligence and share that piece of it. But it's also true that her mother was heavily into it as well. She was very spiritual. And so Victoria and Tennessee were both kind of raised in that framework, and it would totally make sense that that was something that they kind of really bought into. I imagine that the real answer of whether or not what she was doing is true kind of falls somewhere in between those lines, right? Scam or real, who knows? The spiritualism work, it's worth saying, it's not without any risks at this time period. And they don't always, this whole conversation spans kind of many years, but in general, they're not all, Victoria and Tennessee aren't working together necessarily the whole time, and they're not fully a family business. And at one point when Victoria is married and having kids and doing all that, Tennessee and her dad kind of split off and they start to do more heavy healing work. And that was something that Victoria never really was, she was not really into that side of it. And at one point, Tennessee is actually indicted for manslaughter when a cancer patient dies after being treated by her. So spiritualism seemed to kind of pay off for a lot of people, but it also was very risky because it's pseudoscience. It's not even pseudoscience. It's, mythology. So back to Victoria, though. Her first marriage is pretty much an immediate disaster. Her husband, Canning Woodhull, was supposedly, when they got married, a well-to-do doctor. But he turns out to be a super abusive alcoholic who was actually not a successful doctor. He wasn't making any money. And Victoria is 15 and she's married and they have their first kid already, who actually ends up being a mentally handicapped kid. And she is stuck And it's the Victorian era, so all of her property, her 2 children, and she basically belong to her husband, and divorce is not permitted, right? So Victoria kind of buckles in and digs in, and she's like, okay, I'm just going to help make ends meet. Since my husband's not making money, I've got to help doing it too. So she starts dressmaking. She ends up doing a little bit of acting work. And eventually she circles back to that medium work, because that by far of all the things she had done had been the most financially successful. And her medium work, part of her medium work involves a lot of listening to people's stories, right? They're kind of like very early therapists in a way. All these people who are grieving or lost or searching for answers, trying to figure things out, feeling very lost, they would come to her, and a lot of them would share all this information about their horrible marriages and how awful it was and how they were stuck. And Victoria kind of was in this unique position where she herself was suffering through a terrible marriage, and she would listen to all these other women talk about their marriages. And Victoria starts to kind of earnestly believe that divorce is just necessary and really should be allowed. Women should be allowed to divorce their husbands, right? This seems logical now, but back then that was mind-blowing, right? A side note, and this becomes important a little bit later in her story, is that the belief in the ability to divorce at this time period, to leave your husband and to kind of move through marriage more freely, is called free love. And today that term has like a very different connotation. The free love movement of the 70s kind of more sought to dissolve legal marriage entirely and erase like legal bonds of romantic relationships and sexual relationships, in addition to a lot of other things. It's a very, very heavy movement in a lot of ways. But this early, quote, free love was all about the ability to be divorced and to move in and out of marriages, and for basically for women to be able to do that because they weren't allowed to. So that was part of kind of Victoria's developing ideas at this point. In 1864, the Woodhulls moved to St. Louis, my mom's hometown. And as the fates would have it, while she's in St. Louis, she meets the very handsome Colonel James Henry Blood, who, that's right, his name is Blood, very romantic. And he visits Victoria for her medium services. He himself is a big subscriber of spiritualism, and he comes in as a client. And immediately they have this magnetic draw to each other. And supposedly, it's too hilarious to omit this supposed. During this session where they first meet, Victoria goes into a trance and she tells him that his destiny is to marry her. And they do. And they do. They fall in love. They get married. They both divorce their partners and they marry each other because he was married to 2. And Colonel Blood, it turns out, by all this podcast standards at least, he's a pretty good guy, especially compared to her abusive alcoholic husband. So she escapes that nightmare scenario and she's with Colonel Blood. And Colonel Blood is also very progressive. He believes back then these very liberal ideas about birth control and free education and equal rights for women. And Victoria, some of these are new concepts for Victoria, obviously not, the divorcing free love part of it, but all those other things were kind of new for her, and she's on board. She dives right into this social reform movement pretty wholeheartedly. She pretty much decides she wants to be a mover and shaker in the reform movement. But she's also not stupid. She can see that all of the big names in that movement are people that are all very moneyed, right? They're very upper class. Being a reformist, you couldn't be a reformist at the bottom at this time. And so she knows she wants to play in those big leagues and that she is going to need basically her own war chest. So Victoria and her extended family, including Tennessee, they all moved to New York City in 1868. And her in Tennessee set up a business as clairvoyants. Of course, makes sense. They had business cards and everything, a real business. And they get very lucky early on in their business when one day a new client walks into their office, and this guy is the 73-year-old Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. That's right. The millionaire railroad and shipping tycoon himself walks into their office. Research, or my research at least, was unclear as to whether or not he was really into spiritualism. He also maybe just thought they were really hot. But he immediately takes a huge liking to the sisters, and they become friends, and they're hanging out. And by the by, he starts teaching them both about the stock market. And for those of you who don't know who Commodore Vanderbilt is, we can think of him as like the Warren Buffett of our time. He was a stock market whiz. And so Victoria and Tennessee are basically learning from the very best. And Blood, her husband, Colonel Blood, invests some money on their behalf, and they slay it. They're able to make money in the stock market. They make huge gains. And Victoria, who is not, formally educated, but who is very smart, has always been very smart, she immediately sees this as a viable pathway forward and upward the ladder of social reformism. Especially because she knows that she can't really actually hang on to her current job as a clairvoyant because it wasn't a very respectable, reputable business. It was still considered pseudo side, not real, fake hocus pocus, right? And so Victoria knows she's got to kind of move on from that, even though it was her bridge and pathway at one point. So Victoria knows how to jump on the train of opportunity, and opportunity presents itself on September 24th, 1869, which is Black Friday on Wall Street. And people are dumping their stocks and selling them left and right. And Victoria sits her ass outside the exchange building, and she buys up a bunch of bargain stocks that people are unloading. And supposedly in that year, Victoria and Tennessee make $700,000 on the stock market. When we do the calculations, like what that would be worth today, apparently that's like $26.5 million. And there's some sources that say that number was inflated by Victoria to look better, but I'm still incredibly impressed with her. That's a lot of money that she just made, diving into the stock market. And with this success under their belts, the sisters decide that they're going to open their own financial firm with, of course, the blessing of Mr. Vanderbilt, who gives them $7,000 to get started. By the by, it is worth mentioning that some sources talk about Vanderbilt and Tennessee being a little bit more than friends, that they were lovers, and that he even proposed marriage to her at one point. Ooh la la. Hard to tell how much of those rumors are true and how much was from the gossip column, because there was a lot of gossip columning back then. But regardless, Victoria and Tennessee open their firm, Woodhull, Claflin and Company, and they become the first female stockbrokers on Wall Street. And business is good. Things are aligning for Victoria's prospects. And she even hires a tutor to help her develop and refine her reading and writing skills. And by April of 1870, this is all happening very quickly. Victoria's rise to fame happened, and subsequent fall happened very quickly in a short period of years. But by April 1870, she's ready for her big debut in society. And the New York Herald begins to publish a series of articles by her. And she immediately, first issue, comes out of the gate saying, quote, "While others of my sex have devoted themselves to a crusade against the laws that shackle women of the country, I asserted my individual independence. While others prayed for the good time coming, I worked for it. While others argued the equality of woman with man, I proved it by successfully engaging in business. While others sought to show there was no valid reason why women should not be treated socially and politically as being inferior to man, I boldly entered the arena of politics and business and exercised the rights I already possessed. I, therefore, claim the right to speak for the unenfranchised women of the country, and believing as I do that the prejudices which still exist in the popular mind against women in public life will soon disappear, I now announce myself as candidate for the presidency. End quote. That's her first article in the paper. She right out the gate. She is out and proud about her ambitions. So this would be the candidacy for the 1872 election. And in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant, our own hero of the North, was president. And so he was the incumbent on the Democratic ticket. So she knew that it wasn't, not Democratic ticket. Back then it was the Republican ticket. If you remember, the parties were flipped from their current positions. Republicans were liberals and Democrats were conservatives back then. President Lincoln was a Republican. So Grant was a Republican, and she knew she would never be at the top of the ticket because he was the incumbent. So she would have to nominate herself and gather enough supporters to get her name on the ballot independently, an independent candidate. By this point, though, Victoria has a pretty good understanding of how to pierce through that upper-class barrier. So she's got this money that she's made, and she buys a rich-ass house in a rich-ass neighborhood, and she buys a newspaper, which they call Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. That's like what you did when you had money. You bought a newspaper. And the newspaper is kind of a mixture of muckraking, fads, and gossip column. Muckraking, great word. We haven't talked about that word much on this podcast. And in case that's not a word you're familiar with, muckraking is basically social reform literature, which often took the form of corruption exposés, uncovering institutional corruption, or today's equivalent of like investigative journalism, right? Very interesting fact that I think gets blown over in a lot of articles about Victoria is her paper will be the very first one to publish an English language translation of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Isn't that unreal? She's the first one to publish the Communist Manifesto. At the same time, though, as they're publishing the manifesto, they are basically publishing a gossip column because that sold big, sold a lot of papers for gossip. When I think of this part of the story, I think about like Bridgerton, the gossip columns that go around and how everybody reads them. Like that's what Victoria's doing, right? And by fall of 1870, so very quickly, she is circulating the paper to about 20,000 people, which is a pretty big audience. Not a big enough audience, though, to kind of put Victoria at the top of the news cycle. As you recall, women can't vote still. So getting enough votes to be on the ballot and to actually be viable for the office, it's a tall order. So Victoria moves to Washington, D.C. to become an official lobbyist for women's suffrage. And while she's in Washington, D.C., she ends up befriending Massachusetts Congressman Benjamin Butler, who at the time is one of the leading progressive voices in politics. And the two of them become buddies pretty fast, and they put their heads together on women's suffrage. And they're trying to figure out, like, how can we create movement in legislation to get women the vote, right? And they discover what they believe to be a loophole in the amendments, which would provide a very solid argument that women should already be allowed to vote, that they shouldn't even have to earn the right to vote, that it's already given to them. And basically this loophole was in the 14th Amendment, states that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens. And the 15th Amendment states the rights of citizens of the U.S. should not be denied or abridged. So those combined should mean that women born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens, and therefore they cannot be denied the right to vote. And with the help of Benjamin, Victoria is able to bring this argument before the House Judiciary Committee, and she testifies on January 11th, 1871 in front of the committee saying, quote, The citizen who is taxed should also have a voice in the subject matter of taxation. And Victoria is the very first woman to testify in front of Congress. Amazing, right? Again, 1871. This is 1871. And of course, the committee ends up rejecting her petition. But her appearance in front of Congress really catapults her center stage in the suffrage movement. And she becomes very popular with, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, all these like big names in the suffrage movement. And Victoria is finally invited to join the National Women's Suffrage Association. And this was a long-awaited invitation. This is like the golden ticket, right, to the society that she's wanted to break into this whole time. This was a huge goal for her. However, this victory is pretty short-lived because pretty quickly the association members start to see that Victoria isn't just a champion for women's suffrage. She has a lot of social reform issues that she wants to push forward, including national public education, institutionalized welfare for the poor, and of course, the aforementioned free love. The latter of those, free love, was extremely unpopular amongst these highfalutin, non-intersectional to the max suffragists. They only wanted to focus, first of all, on suffragism, on the women's right to vote, and free love was radical to them. It was way too radical. And Victoria basically was too radical for kind of the mainstream suffrage movement. There's a couple different quotes from speeches that Victoria made around this time period. One of them was, quote, "I want the love of you all promiscuously. It makes no difference who or what you are, old or young, black or white, pagan, Jew, or Christian. I want to love you all and be loved by you all, and I mean to have your love." End quote. She also said, quote, "Let women issue a declaration of independence sexually and absolutely refuse to cohabit with men until they are acknowledged as equals in everything, and the victory would be won in a single week." End quote. And these are all big words. These are big radical words for the time. Right now they seem like punk rock and awesome to me, but back then they were scandalous. She also kind of lived this truth. And pretty openly, like her lifestyle wasn't a huge secret. At one point, she's living with her ex-husband and her husband and her lover in the same apartment, I'm sure with her children. She's like living the free love life, and it's scandalous. And then she gives this giant speech on November 20th, 1871, and she really, really digs down into those free love views. And at this point, it's so public, and the press just rake her over the coals about it. And the National Women's Suffrage Association ends up pulling their support of her. They kick her out, and she's basically pushed out of the mainstream suffragist movement into this more radical splinter of it, people who have broken off. And there's this splintered group of both men and women who create what's called the Equal Rights Party. Not the Green Party, the Equal Rights Party back then. And in 1872, the Equal Rights Party nominates Victoria for president. And they also nominate Frederick Douglass as vice president. Now, Douglass supposedly never accepted or even acknowledged the nomination, which is kind of it's a little bit of a mystery to me. I didn't find in the research more about that situation, so I'm not sure like exactly how all of that went down. So maybe they made like a big gamble that he would be on board, but they hadn't checked in with him beforehand, or maybe they just kind of straight up made this PR decision that it would look really good for them to have him on the ballot and it would boost their numbers even if he wasn't on board. I kind of don't know. Those are all speculative on my part. But certainly they were, of all of the parties out there, they were what we would consider today the most intersectional, where they really are fighting for equal rights for everybody, and that more kind of intersectional view, even though that word would not, become a word until later. Even though on paper all this equal rights party stuff sounds great, and her getting the official nomination sounds great, Victoria was actually not doing so hot otherwise. Her big free love speeches end up pushing her out of favor with the general population, and especially all of her rich and influential friends that she had gained. And she lost a lot of her financial backers, and she had dumped a ton of her own money into the campaign, and also her Wall Street firm goes broke, and she's kicked out of her fancy-ass rich house. She has to suspend her publications with the paper. And then the final nail in Victoria's public coffin would end up being the gossipy scandals that had made her paper so successful in the first place. I know I mentioned Bridgerton, but if any of you also watch The Gilded Age on Netflix, I should have said this at the very beginning. This is that same time period. This is the beginning of the Gilded Age, what we're talking about right here, Victoria's story. And what I feel like comes next, it feels like it could be like a plot on the show. Maybe it will be. Who knows? So it turns out that one of Victoria's biggest social, societal enemies were the Beecher sisters. That's right, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And her and her sister Catherine were like mortal enemies of Victoria's. Despite their loud support of abolition, the Beechers vehemently hated the suffragist movement. Very interesting, right? I did not know this. And Victoria, being one of the loudest suffragists of the time, was their loathed enemy. But Victoria ran a gossip column, and she had some dirt on the Beecher family, specifically on their brother, who was a pastor, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. And the Reverend, who, by the by, had been preaching vehemently in the pulpit against free love, apparently could not keep it in his pants, had a scandalous affair with the wife of one of his colleagues, and possibly even got her pregnant. Got her pregnant! And Victoria had this tea. And it's not exactly clear why she does it. It could have been because the Reverend turned her down when she asked for campaign donations, or maybe she wanted social revenge on the Beechers. Maybe she was just looking for that PR boost before Election Day, or maybe it's some combination of all those, right? But in October 1872, she reopens the paper and she issues a special issue entirely focused on the Reverend Beecher's affair. And specifically the absurd double standard that it reflected, both that men could have affairs and get away with it, but women were trapped in bad marriages and couldn't leave, and also that he was preaching so loudly against free love, but he was enjoying the benefits of free love, right? And the issue sold like crazy. Everybody bought and rebought, used copies even, prices went up, but the rich and snobby twats could not let this stand. And Victoria and Tennessee are both arrested for distributing indecent literature through the mail. And they end up spending election night in jail. As you can expect, the election does not go great for Victoria. Even though her name appeared on ballots in a couple states, nobody knows how many votes she received because they apparently weren't even counted. Boo. And at this point, her remaining supporters all pretty much step away and her political campaign collapses. Her and Tennessee will spend 2 months in jail, and they keep being rearrested a few times after they're released for libel and slander for a few other stories. And the press continue to destroy her again and again. Harriet Beecher Stowe calls Victoria, quote, a vile jailbird and, quote, an impudent witch, I love that one. Impudent. That one should be on a shirt. I'm going to look for that shirt. And there's a cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who depicted Victoria as, quote, Mrs. Satan. She was reviled. And I shouldn't even laugh. It's so terrible. Like, everything she stood for was great. And it's so sad. Like, we've seen this before for other broads, right? Where the press release all of these rumors and just destroy a woman. Victoria will make a couple more attempts at presidential runs, but none of them are even mildly successful. And Victoria is never able to gain back any of the good graces of the suffragist movement. She does not get invited to speak at suffrage conventions. There was a British suffrage leader advised not to meet with her because, quote, both sisters are regarded as lewd and indecent. And when a comprehensive history of the women's suffrage movement is published in the 1880s, they completely omit Victoria. Like, she's not even mentioned, even though she's the first in a lot of different ways of the movement. Victoria and Tennessee, in a full circle turn of events, they end up in front of the Vanderbilts again. This time, after old Mr. Vanderbilt dies, his family is squabbling over their inheritance. And as the court date approaches, one of the Vanderbilt's sons straight up just pays off the sisters to move to England. It's not, sources are like not clear on exactly why, but there's the general thought that because they were so influential with old Vanderbilt, that it was going to create complications in the splitting of the will and all of their inheritance, and they just wanted the sisters out of there. So they basically pay them to leave the United States. And, you know, Victoria and Tennessee, their fortunes and their prospects are really low. They've lost everything. They built their fortunes and they lost them. And so they take the money and they go to England. And in England, Victoria would end up meeting her third husband, a wealthy banker. Once again, she finds fortune. She finds fortune many times in her life. It's actually kind of incredible. She will end up running a new newspaper. She dedicates herself to preserving the English home of George Washington's ancestors. She also apparently became a huge automobile enthusiast. There's like stories of her driving her automobiles around and waving, and it was the talk of the town. She would donate a lot of money and services to people in the area she lived in, and she would travel overseas one more time to run for president in 1892, obviously not successfully. She founded a short-lived agricultural school, and she volunteered with the Red Cross during World War I. And then eventually she will die in 1927 at the ripe old age of 89. Which is really incredible for that time period. And that, my friends, is the remarkable Victoria C. Woodhull. So many things I learned in her story about that time period, about the suffragist movement, the splintering of it, the opinions, what douches that the Stowes were. Holy shit, we didn't know, right? Or I didn't know. Maybe you guys knew. Victoria was an absolutely incredible woman. She defies so many frameworks for women in that time period. Coming from nothing, building her fortunes 3 times, nonetheless, maybe even more. There were a lot of ups and downs in her life. And running for president, appearing before Congress, things that just were not done. And even just speaking so freely about her beliefs. Even about free love, it takes a lot of guts to do that. And I'm continuously in awe of women who put themselves out there. And it was, you know, you wonder why people don't do that. And then you see the story of her downfall and how she's eventually, kicked out of the suffragist movement. But she really believed in what she believed, and she really stood up for it. And what an incredible broad to add to our podcast. I'm glad to have her on the roster here now. And if you are curious more about her. Obviously, she did a lot of things in her life, and this is kind of a small snippet of it, but I hope you'll look up more about her because she truly was incredible. To learn more about Victoria C. Woodhull, see pictures of her, quotes from this episode, and other things, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, click on over to the About page and read more about me. My bio, picture, links to all my stuff, all there. Also, you should follow Broads You Should Know on social. We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Broads You Should Know. Like, subscribe, comment, all those things help us. We're also on Twitter at BYSK Podcast. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you are a fan of the podcast, I ask you, heart to heart, share this with your friends and family. That is the best way to help new listeners find us. Everybody loves listening to stories about cool broads. Broads You Should Know is produced by me, Sarah Gorski, and edited by Chloe Skye, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you really enjoyed the story of Victoria C. Woodhull, then I definitely suggest you listen to some of our other broads, including especially Miss Shirley Chisholm. Just dial back 1 week to hear her story. You should also check out Irish suffragist Mary Maloney, who rang a bell to drown out Winston Churchill, and of course my personal queen of feminism, Bell Hooks. We'll see you next week for another Broad You Should Know.